Joining me today is one of the mayoral candidates, Mr. Kevin Klein. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. We're going to start with a very simple question. Why
Uh-oh.
did you why did you decide to run for mayor?
Well, I'll be very frank about this. I had spent, almost the entirety of my life in the private sector. And several years ago, I was approached about running for politics. And in municipal politics, I found that, that's a level of government where you can actually get a lot of stuff done. And I decided to run for council in 2018. And I did that because I spent an awful lot of time in the media, like yourself, and always thought that government was dysfunctional. From watching reporters cover it, from covering certain government levels myself in the past, and so on. So I wanted to get inside, and I had to see for myself what the issues were and are they repairable. And when I got inside, I thought, well, I was wrong. It was actually more dysfunctional and more divisive internally than I thought it would be. And it really caught me by surprise because really we work for the almost 800 people that live in the city of Winnipeg. We have a job to do. We have to work for them and represent them and do what's in their best interest. And I found that we were spending more times talking about virtue signaling items through council than we were on the issues at hand in our city that needed our attention.
People in Winnipeg overwhelmingly list homelessness and poverty at the top of their issues during this election. How do you plan to help people experiencing homelessness in the city?
So that's a really good question. And I believe that I'm really the only candidate that understands this because my childhood, a lot of people, it's funny, I see things on social media and they always point to me as living this privileged life. But as a child, we grew up, for the most part, single mom. We lived in government housing, never really owned a house. Never owned a house. It's not really, we just never owned a house. And then my mom was murdered by her partner. So it took my brothers and I, we didn't have a lot of family around and supports, and there really isn't a lot of things going on with governments to help you in those situations and such. And I found myself having to stay in a Salvation Army shelter for a couple of days. So I understand what it's like to be in that position. And I wasn't there nearly as long as some of these individuals that find themselves there now. I wouldn't compare my situation to them. But what I do understand is the fear of having to go to a shelter, the fear of being inside the shelter, and how important it is to have somebody offer you help and offer you a way out. So yesterday I made an announcement, a policy announcement, that when mayor, I will address the homeless situation as a crisis. And when we address it as a crisis, we get to pull some levers. And one of the levers we would pull is to get funding from the federal government to bring in accommodation trailers. Now we're seeing those in some places in Manitoba where they've used them for disaster relief and so on. But we're starting to see jurisdictions across Canada and BC and a couple in Ontario and some in the East Coast using them to address their homeless situation. And these are, trailers that come in that allow a person to have their own space with their own key, have their own belongings in there, and that is theirs. And why is that so important? Well, we know in talking with homeless advocates across the country and certain services that work with homeless people that 30% of the homeless people need to get a job. They're just trying to get a job and they're in a difficult spot. But they can't really apply for a job or apply for any federal funding without an address. So when you do the accommodation trailers, you're giving that person an address, and you have social services or social workers on site that can help people do the paperwork. And now all of a sudden they're getting the government funding that's allowed to them, that's offered to them that they couldn't get weeks ago. And now they start going down that path and they have their own place. They're feeling confident. They can work on getting a deposit. They can start applying for jobs, and it takes them out of that situation. I believe, watching it from inside and taking a look from the outside, that we're not taking the appropriate action to help people. We're throwing money at a lot of different programs, and we're pointing fingers at a lot of other people saying, well, they should be responsible, they should be responsible. But if we're going to lead the city, we need to take a leadership role and take action. And I had vowed to do that on my first day in office, would be to start reaching out, or just to reach out immediately to the federal government, asking for accommodation trailers for the funding, reaching out to them for support for social services through the provincial government. And I would reach out to our Indigenous government leaders and say, how do we work together to solve this problem?
Thank you, first of all, for sharing your own personal story. Definitely appreciate that, and for sharing that answer. Crime is also at the top of many people's list. What needs to be done to reduce crime here in Winnipeg?
I was the head of the police board for some time, and I have a lot of history with police services. I've done work with other police services across our country. There's a lot of solutions to our crime problem. Yet again, it's a crisis in our city. So it requires different solutions. But the very first thing we need to do is allow police to do their job. And we cannot, and I will not tolerate somebody calling 911 while their house is being invaded. And the operator, this happened in St. James a few weeks ago, where the operator said, I'm sorry, we have no cars available. Lock yourself in a bedroom. Don't make any fuss, don't make any noise until they leave, and then we'll try to get out there. It took 3 or 4 days before an officer to show up at that property. And that's because they're busy in the queue. And why is that? Well, my research has proved that in 1998, there was 28 police cars, patrol cars, that protected the city of Winnipeg throughout our areas. And in 2022, and granted, the city has grown exponentially, like our footprint has grown and our population has grown, but we still only have 28 police cars patrolling the city of Winnipeg. That has never changed in 28 to 30 years. We need to address that by saying, how do we reallocate resources and how do we deal with that? And what we found out in doing that research is that on most nights, and I had a community meeting at the Dakota Community Center last night where police officers attended. And one police officer agreed and said he started his shift the other day and spent the first 6 hours of his shift waiting at a hospital for a person in custody to be treated. 6 hours. So that car is off the street. And what we understand and what we've learned through our research is that some nights you have up to 10 police cars at HSC off the street waiting for 6, 7, sometimes 8 hours with somebody in custody. So I vowed already to come forward and say, and do what we can do right now, short-term fix, which is put sheriffs, work with the province to put sheriffs in place, even if the city has to pay that price, let's pay it. So that police officers can drop off somebody in custody. They can wait with the sheriff who is legally allowed to detain individuals or cadets, and then let the police get back on the street so we don't have people in need of 911 waiting and waiting because we have 10 police cars at a hospital. And what this officer shared with me last night is it was very disheartening for them because there's a time when an incident will be happening where an officer is in danger and it goes to what's called radio silence. And there they are sitting in a hospital and they know they're close to help that officer, but they can't leave. And now all of a sudden it's radio silence, so they don't know what's going on. So they're stressed, they're worried about this. Or I talked to officers that said, their own family has called them and said somebody was stealing our car and nobody came. They don't like this, so we have to help them fix that problem. That's how we start to address the crime. But we also look at the homelessness program that I talked about earlier, and I know this is a long one, but it's very passionate for me. The other thing we have to do is start offering more community programs to our young people in the neighborhoods where they can't or they don't have the means to take part in community sports or in community programming. We need to make that available because I can tell you as a child, when those services started to go away, you start to turn to bad things. You start looking for some way to belong. And unfortunately, people can get, or young people can get, targeted by gangs to start doing their dirty work because they're under the age of jail time or whatever that is, that's on us. That's our fault as a community. We should be putting those programs in place and working with the organizations that want to offer programming to these young people. We owe that to them to give them a fresh start, a good start, so that in 20 years from now, they're not in the same situation that others are today.
Future approach.
Yeah.
A lot of top issues might also involve provincial or federal jurisdiction. How do you plan to improve relationships with other governments?
Well, I'm really happy to say that because of my time in the private sector as a chief executive officer and for a media company and so on, I've had the honor of working with several levels of government and politicians over the years, and I still maintain a lot of contacts with our federal counterparts. Most of them in ministerial roles where I think they can help us, and the same with the province. I have I have a wonderful relationship with our Premier, Heather Stephenson, but also I have, I spend time with Wob Canoe. His son plays hockey, and a few times I've refereed his son in hockey games, and Wob was a coach, and I've met with Dugald Lamont, and we've had coffee together, and we go back and forth, and Dr. Gerard and others. I think unfortunately, we have a bit of an identity crisis in city politics where we think we're in charge of everything and people just have to give us money to fix things. Instead, we have to look at the reality, and the reality is that we have a certain portion of the city that we're responsible for and actions that we're responsible for, and we need the provincial government. We shouldn't be fighting. We need them, and we need to work together. But I also want to include that not just do we need a good working relationship with the provincial government and the federal government, we need to improve our relationship and our working relationship with Indigenous government leaders, because we have failed there. We have failed to bring them to the table, and I will do that as mayor.
This spring highlighted the city's crumbling road infrastructure. How do you plan to address this?
Well, listen, there's no easy fix for roads, and I've heard other candidates make some wonderful promises about how they're going to fix potholes and how they're going to fix roads. I have a colleague of mine who was our finance chair, who's promised to extend roads and widen roads, but he's been in office as the finance person for several years and did nothing. There was a suggestion of adding a 1% tax to do roads. Well, everybody in Winnipeg should know that over the last 8 years, our property taxes have gone up almost 20%, and 2% every year was supposed to be dedicated to roads. But recently, we haven't put it into roads because we have budget problems. And I don't know if it's a revenue problem or a spending problem, but I'm leaning towards spending problem. So how we're going to fix roads is with a better relationship with our provincial and federal partners, and to make sure that the money that we get to fix roads actually goes to fixing roads, because I don't think it would be a shock to you as a journalist or to residents that a lot of the money we get from the federal government or provincial for roads sometimes gets used for other things. Let's use the money for roads to fix the roads, and let's fix them one at a time. The other thing I would do is put an infrastructure plan together, and I've already agreed to do that and committed to do that, spend $2 million. Because did you know we don't have an infrastructure plan for the city of Winnipeg? Every year we change it. We pick new priorities or different priorities based on political ambitions. We need to know where the worst roads are and address them in order of importance and put in standard procedures. So that means everyone who does road work is all working from the same page. That will actually bring our costs down. So it doesn't really answer your question other than to say, I'm going to put a plan together and we're going to put the money that we get for roads on roads, and we're going to fix the roads one road at a time. In addition to that, and the final point is we're going to maintain our roads. We've stopped regular maintenance of many of our streets. That causes the cracks. If we're not filling the cracks with that, I don't know what that stuff is. It looks like black glue to me. I'm not an expert. But if we're not doing that, like I'm being told we're not doing, water gets down. Water gets down, the earth underneath moves. And when the earth underneath moves, potholes happen. So we have to take many steps forward in our regular maintenance that we've stopped doing in the last 8 years. We've stopped a lot of regular maintenance. And that's why if you look at the city, it looks like it's fractured in many different ways.
You've sort of answered this question already, but where is the money going to come from to accomplish what you hope to do as mayor if elected?
It's a good question. And a lot of the promises that I've made thus far and all of the promises that you will hear about in the future do not cost taxpayers more money. It's using the funds that we have right now and reallocating them to the most important issues that are happening in the city. We shouldn't be spending millions of dollars on political projects when we have to address our homeless situation or we have to address crime. So the very first thing I will do, and I'm the only candidate that has the corporate executive experience to do multi-million dollars, budgets in the hundreds of millions of dollars I've done, to be able to go in there and say, okay, we need to make sure that we don't have a spending problem. If we have a revenue problem, we'll address that. But the very first thing we need to know is find out where every dollar is going. And right now, if you look at the City of Winnipeg budget, it's very high level. You barely get an idea of what's being spent on what. We need to dig into that. And we need to find out where it's going and put the money where it's needed most. Now, if we discover that we have a revenue problem, which I don't believe we have, but maybe there is somewhere, then we'll address that. But first and foremost, I'm not going to add more taxes to the residents of Winnipeg or more frontage fees or more fees until I know for sure that we're managing their money properly.
Where can people find out more about Kevin Klein's platform?
Well, don't go to Kevin Klein, the actor. That would be a mistake. But you can go to my website, kevinklein.ca, and I have hundreds of videos online that you can look at where I talk about different issues. You can see what I've done in the last 4 years, and you can see how we will address the many solutions required for crime, how we will better utilize cadets so that we have more patrols in neighborhoods and so on. It's all there on the website. And I have to thank you for this opportunity because I think, even as an ex-media person, it's so important for the media to inform residents about this election because this is a critical election. And we don't need to recycle old political ideas or politicians. We need to move our city forward in a different way because it isn't working anymore.
Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Klein. It's been a pleasure. And thank you.
Thank you. Please always call me Kevin.